Welcome everyone. I apologize. I think I might be a minute or two late, and there might be a little bit of noise around where I am. We're having a little bit of practice together. So, anyway, welcome once again to our study of Omniscient Jigme Lingpa's Treasury of Precious Qualities. And as always, kindly generate the intention of bodhicitta, recognizing the value of what we're studying here in terms of how this is the remedy that actually gets to the bottom of suffering universally everywhere. So with that sort of recognition of the importance, the value, the greatness of what we're studying, then we're then presently in the second chapter of the text, and we'll begin with invoking Jigme Lingpa. Oh yes, by the way, Happy New Year. All the very best for 2022. The source of love and compassion for all beings, who knows all that is knowable, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind termas, sky-like yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity, Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. So, in case you're wondering what it means to reach the far shore of liberation, this might be what it looks like. Okay. So we're presently then within the contemplation of impermanence. We're up to verse 6, where Jigme Lingpa writes, a powerful bowman's shaft is swift indeed, but not as swift as pretas moving on the earth. The pretas in the air are swifter still, and swifter yet the gods of sun and moon. But swiftest of them all is human life. So Kangyur Rinpoche in his commentary has, imagine that 4 giants, tremendously strong, stand back to back, and each shoots an arrow directly in front of him. It would be a quick man indeed who could run around and catch them all before they fell to earth. Yet even quicker are the pretas that move over the earth, propelled by the miraculous force that is the fruit of their karma. Faster than the earthbound pretas are the pretas that move through the air, and even faster are the chariots of the sun and moon, while swiftest of them all are the divine beings who move miraculously through the strength of their merit. Yet quicker than all of these is the passing of a human life. Again, we can recognize the value of this kind of study and contemplation in that this very strongly goes against what certainly in our younger years we presume is a life that lasts a long time. And of course we can also say time is very relative, but the fact of the matter is once life is slipping away, then it's just going to be nothing but just memories. Everything that is in the past, including then this life, will just be an instant that was gone. Lies in the past is no more than a memory. So that reflection that we are undertaking here of recognizing the incredible swiftness with these images is very significant, actually also in terms of its poetic beauty. So the next, let me just see if there's more commentary here. Yeah. So then verse 7, the prime of youth is ravaged and brought low by age. Disease disturbs health equilibrium, and perfect situations are all ruined by decay. So soon does death lay siege to life? Now, there's never ever going to be a time when these reflections are no longer relevant. So as long as we're on the path, we never stop to reflect on these. And in fact, I remember Matthew Ricard once sort of just noticing or commenting, musing how over the years that he had been studying the Dharma, then these reflections, they took more and more sort of, you could say, seemed more and more vivid, more and more real. So this is something that we continually revisit. And of course, what many of us can confirm is that it doesn't take long before all of a sudden there's no longer that sort of familiar sense of being young, and the physique is sort of just in a particular way, and it begins to become an increasing discrepancy between how we think of ourselves and then the person that we face in the mirror. So Kangyur Rinpoche comments, the body of a man or woman still growing to early adulthood is magnificent and strong, but in due course their constitution begins to falter, and it is as if they are being punished by the scourge of old age. When the four elements are balanced, all is well, but then illness strikes and torments the body and mind. I think four elements, fairly straightforward. The body is said to be composed of the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, corresponding to the principles of solidity, movement, warmth, and liquidity. To these is added space, without which the others could not exist. When equilibrium between the elements is lost, a disease occurs. So this is, again, those who are familiar with Tibetan medicine recognize how all illness is really seen in terms of imbalance. But continually we have this, you could say, ground of our physical that exists in terms of the four elements and space. It may be that, for the moment, thanks to positive actions done in the past and the coincidental effects of favorable conditions, people experience great happiness and the pleasure of companions, wealth, fame, and so forth. But since all that meet must separate, and all that is accumulated drains away, all of this will decline. When the momentum of this life is lost, or when certain untimely circumstances occur, death, in all its dreadfulness, will throw itself upon them without delay. This is described with many examples in the Vajra Vavadaka Sutra. So now we then have these quotes. Again, there's so much of this that you could say, well, I know that. Do I need to be reminded? This is where, yes, more than anything, there's probably nothing that is more inconceivable than our own, you could say, volatility, our own impermanence, our own mortality. So this is where everything that we're saying here is something that we know, and yet somehow it's suppressed. Just from a habitual pattern of superficiality, then we just tend to not be aware of it. And even if we are aware of it, to actually really bring home the purpose of this in terms of what we are looking at is not just a sort of a depressed view like I am getting old, but rather through the recognition of this, then this is what really becomes an incentive for us to engage with greater commitment to the practice of the path. So here then 8, 9, and 10 reads, defeated in their struggle with the Lord of Death, beings plunge protectorless and friendless down in the abyss. The glow of life is dimmed, the senses fail, and doctors with their cures all turn away. Then comes the feeble twitching of exhausted limbs, the failing breath that rattles in the throat, the family and friends who stand around and grieve, and pray their useless prayers that death may be delayed. The movement of the breath, now fine as horse's hair, is severed by the sharp axe of the deadly Lord. All beauty now departs, the grin of death appears, and karma brings the bardo's deep black night. So again, the intention here is for us just to recognize the value of the present situation. Kangyur Rinpoche says, when the time of death comes, our much cherished bodies are overthrown in the struggle with the Lord of Death. Even Vajrapani can give us no protection, and we plunge into the abyss of hopeless suffering. At that time, the provisions of this life mean nothing anymore, and the glow of youth fades and withers like a flower in the frost. The five sense faculties fail to cease to function like a flame blown out in the wind. No medicine can soothe the pain of the cutting of the thread of life. Even if the universal remedy were to hand, it would be to no avail, and even doctors as skillful as Jivaka Kumara, Sochishuna, the most celebrated physician in the time of the Buddha, even such a great doctor must turn away from patients who look at them with their eyes wide and staring with terror. There is nothing to be done. The thing is also with death is that everything that's familiar to us, we can try and see how when we are feeling a little bit ungrounded, not well, what we long for is actually something that's familiar, something that gives us a sense of grounding, reference points. And that's exactly what happens when we're dying, is that all familiar reference points, the dearest reference points in terms of our belongings, and particularly friends, family, and so forth, all of this is slipping away. And that's where there's this, in the case of someone who hasn't achieved some confidence in terms of what comes, there's this condition of complete terror. Nobody wants to leave. And yet at that point, there's nothing that can be done. Kangyur Rinpoche continues that when the energy that imparts movement to the body begins to decline, there comes complete exhaustion and paralysis. And as it begins to flow abnormally, the limbs shudder and twist. Respiration is difficult, and the rattling of the breath is short and feeble. All around, the family stands, father, mother, friends, and kin. Everyone is sobbing and lamenting, pleading with their loved ones not to leave them. But the hook of their prayers can find no purchase. The dying person starts to gasp as respiration becomes increasingly shallow, fine, like a strand of horsehair. So what happens at this point is what's documented and detailed in the teachings on the bardo, particularly the bardo at the time of death, is actually the dissolution of the elements. So that's where the sense of solid, the sense of the body's physical, what we call the earth element, dissolves into water, and then at that time there's a feeling of heaviness, not being able to move. At that time, then the water then dissolves into fire. Then there's this drying up, particularly around the mouth. There's a dryness, and this then goes into the subtle aspects of the air element, which then dissolves into space. And it's at that time then that as this dissolves into space, then there is at what we actually call the point of separation from body. So that's where Kangyur Rinpoche then writes, and then the ruthless Lord of Death severs it with the edge of his sharp axe. And of course, we're not talking about any kind of, say, external entity here, but we're simply just talking about the principle that applies. Of all of a sudden, there's no more. In that instant, the bloom and beauty of life vanishes. The face becomes livid, the eyes filled with tears, and the skin of the face is stretched towards the back of the skull. The mouth opens, and teeth become visible in the grinning rictus of death. The thick darkness of the bardo, of becoming, comes to meet the dying, and they are driven from behind by the cyclonic wind of karma. They must pass through many terrifying hallucinations. 6 uncertainties will come about, those of location, resting place, behavior, sustenance, companions, and mental state. Then there will be the 3 dreadful abysses of hatred, desire, and confusion, white as ash, dark red, and black. 4 dreadful sounds will occur. As the energy of the earth element re-emerges, a roar will be heard, as of collapsing mountains. As the energy of the fire element re-emerges, there will be the sound of blazing forests. As the energy of water element re-emerges, there will be the crashing of tumultuous seas. And as the energy of the air element re-emerges, there will be the shrieking of a gale, like the winds at the end of time. So, again, if you look in the teachings on the Bardo, particularly if you look in Karma Lingpa's, what's called the liberation through hearing in the Bardo, there is a guide actually to those who are undergoing these experiences and what to do at that time, how to handle these experiences and understand that what is happening is just like in a dream. These are all projections of the mind, but not having the confidence in that nature which is beyond the ordinary projections of our mind, then there's being this experience, just like not recognizing a dream, of being swept away. And that is where the instruction is to continually come back to recognition. But the point here is, and also that is the point in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the great liberation through hearing in the Bardo. The point is that reading this while we still have the opportunity to work with all the right conditions, then we need to understand that at that time, if we don't, unless we have achieved a great confidence, then we will be subjected to these situations of great uncertainty and so forth. And that's where this sort of new age idea of, when you die, just go into the light, just doesn't apply. The light happens, but unless one has confidence, then merging with that, and essentially what we call the fusing of the mother and son luminosities, which is the scope of somebody with great realization, unless one has that, then yes, there's a light, but it happens as long as the snap of a finger. So that's where we shouldn't really sort of be naive about this situation and think, oh yeah, we'll be fine. There is a need to really achieve that, which enables us to recognize that luminosity at the time of death. Unless we have those conditions, then we're rather lost. So the reflection here again is, as Kangyur Rinpoche says, from now on, may the thought of our impermanence spur us on. So this was then the second chapter on mindfulness. I'm sorry, impermanence. And so now, we've looked at the first, what was it again? Let's see here, contents. So the first section here, the first chapter, was turning the mind to the Dharma. So that was chapter 1. And then part 2, that was turning our mind to the Dharma, and that's on the basis of reflecting on this unique opportunity of our human rebirth. And then we have what we've just completed here, the part 2, an incentive for the practice, and which is then the meditation on impermanence, what we've just looked at. And now we come to then part 3, and this will actually be the rest of the book that we're studying now, the gradual path of the 3 kinds of beings. So these are then the beings who wish to be free of suffering and have higher rebirth, those who wish to be free from samsara altogether, and those who wish to bring others out of samsara. So within this context then, we now look at this third part, where we're now looking at the path of beings of lesser scope. So these are the ones who just want to be free of suffering and have a higher rebirth. But that's valid. There's never ever a time where we poo-poo any of, you could say, any level. You could say all the levels build on each other. The appreciation of precious human rebirth is essential. The understanding of impermanence is essential. And what we're going to look at now is then the reflection of karma, which is essential. And that is, of course, where we understand that actions have an impact. Already here, we are operating with what in fact is generally said to be uniquely the scope of the higher realms, which is the awareness that what we do have an impact. So that's where we begin to have an understanding and the understanding of the relevance of ethical conduct. And, we don't have that sort of idea that, we can just do what we want. We understand that everything we do has an impact. This is, of course, something that we know from our experience. At the same time, there's very often that in sort of just common discourse, and again, particularly in modern discourse, there's sort of the idea that, life just happens and it's random and we can't do anything about it and so on and so forth. So there's sort of a dogma that prevents us really from appreciating what, in fact, we know from our experience. And of course, also what we see then in the teachings from great sages all across the various traditions of wisdom and religion and so on, that our future is very much in our hands right now. So what we do makes a big difference. Sometimes there's sort of a fascination in modernity around the idea of karma, that's some sort of mystical thing, but it's not really mystical, it's just cause and effect. Just like we can see cause and effect outside in the natural world, we can also see cause and effect within our own mind. We sustain a particular attitude, there's the result. We sustain an attitude of resentment, anger, we're going to have a corresponding sort of depressed feeling. We sustain an attitude of gratitude or rejoicing, and there's a corresponding feeling that comes with that. And all of these, they go down as imprints within our storehouse consciousness, and that is essentially what constructs us. That is what creates our being and also our experience in terms of the world around us. So in this way, we are not really looking at anything particularly mystical at all. And it's also interesting that in the Buddhist context, there's not any fascination around the idea of rebirth. It's just a practical phenomenon that we need to take into account. And that's where we would say, when it comes to sort of where do we come from, what was I in my previous life, or what might I be in my next life, there's this very pragmatic saying that simply goes, if you want to know what you were in your previous life, look at your present situation. If you want to know where you will be in your future life, look at your present actions. So that's where what we mean with karma is certainly not like there's sort of the idea that karma means everything is predestined, determined, and so on. Not at all. Karma really means the realization of the empowerment that lies in our actions. You could say the responsibility for our future, but also empowerment in the sense that we actually are in a position to shape our future. So that's the law of karma. And so here then, in the root text, in the root text, it says, the first two verses, I think. Yeah, first two verses. Those who travel thus to future lives attain them, high or low, as though bound by a rope, drawn only by their virtuous deeds or ingrained evil ways. The relative, the all-concealing truth is inescapable. The different virtues of a farmer's seeds are manifested in his crops, and different destinies are likewise made by many deeds, ingrained and grown, accustomed to in former lives. So we should understand that karma really means that there's no way of us avoiding the result of our actions. Just like there's no way that an apple seed is all of a sudden going to go ahead and become a pumpkin. If we have an apple seed, there's no way that it won't become an apple tree, an apple plant, and so forth, right? So that's where our actions, nothing else is going to shape what we are in terms of higher rebirth, lower rebirth, and so forth. And this we can even see within our own present life. We can see how our actions have an impact. And that's how relative truth works. So that's where within the condition of cause and effect, which is the condition of our present deluded situation that we can call samsara, which is the dualistic condition in which we fixate on a self, we fixate on the object of the self, we have a continual experience of time and space in which cause and effect plays out. This is the nature of relative truth. In Tibetan, relative truth is called kunsop, which means that which conceals. So you could say relative truth, our delusion conceals the underlying unconditional, you could say, ground, where you could say the mind innately possesses the condition of freedom, what we can call Buddha nature, and so forth. And that is what we are uncovering through the practice of the path. But until this nature has been uncovered, until we realize absolute truth, then we're held by relative truth. That's where we are held by the law of cause and effect. So that's what the point here is. And then we have the image, which is then the farmer, the seeds, you could say the virtues or the value or the say the disposition of seeds will become manifest once they're planted and they fructify as crops. So likewise also where we will come to, what will drive that are all our actions. And these actions, they are the actions that we have laid down on our ground consciousness. So that's where these then have the habitual patterns that we have perpetuated. So again, the message to us here on we're traveling the path is to not be held by the obscuring habitual patterns and to uncover the conditional and freedom. So Kangyur Rinpoche then says, commenting on the karmic process in general, he says, there is absolutely no doubt that when we die, we must go where we are propelled. Like fish caught on a hook, we are entangled in the strings of our karma and pulled into one or other of the 6 realms, high or low. There is nothing but the effect of actions, positive or negative. It is true that, ultimately speaking, there is no such a thing as origination, but on the level of relative truth, the karmic principle of cause and effect is inescapable. It is like a gardener planting 2 kinds of seeds, the bitter aloe or the sweet grape. The resulting crops will have a corresponding taste. In the same way, the existential quality of our present lives, whether fortunate or otherwise, is but the product of positive or negative actions to which we have become accustomed in our previous existences. Now, just a comment here in terms of us who come from a world in which there's no reference. Okay, let me just see here. How can we contemplate on death without getting depressed? Or is depression here good for us, especially in these COVID years? That's a very good question. That's the point that I was making and repeating, because I know that some people will think, oh, thinking of death is going to make us depressed. And that's how it is for ordinary persons. But here we're in a different situation. We have the problem that we are going to die. And at that time, we would be swept away powerlessly. But that's the problem. The thing is, here we have the solution, and that is to not be swept away powerlessly. And that's where the next, somebody here is asking, what is the universal remedy mentioned? The universal remedy is the practice of the path, to understand the causes and conditions that are going to give us temporarily happiness, higher rebirth, and ultimately free us from the delusion that we're situated within, which we call samsara. And that's where sometimes you see the representation of samsara with the different realms of samsara, and then you see the Buddha outside pointing to the moon, and essentially like somebody who says you could get out of this. So that's the point. We meditate on impermanence because otherwise what happens is that we're carried away, our life will be carried away by things that have very little consequence and very little, because they ultimate value. And that's where we want to make decisions. We want to prioritize intelligently so that we presently, with all the conditions present in terms of having a precious human rebirth, realizing our situation, that we then choose to do what could take us outside of this cycle of suffering. And that's where, when we sometimes hear traditional accounts of the six realms, we might think, gosh, this sounds terrible, and this sounds dreadful, and it sounds very medieval and Hieronymus Bosch, and all of that. We don't want to know anything about this. I thought Buddhism was a very intelligent religion, and now I'm coming in here and there's all sorts of, I'm being threatened by, rebirth and hell and all these kind of things. And that's not at all what we're talking about here. It's simply just understanding that particular conditions create particular experiences. Just like nowadays we're living with the pandemic. Well, we might not want to know about the pandemic, but it's a reality. We might not want to know about certain realities, but we simply need to know about these realities. That's where what we're talking about here is just really the Buddha, you could say, calling you could say a spade, being quite honest or straightforward with it. But there is an issue for the modern person, and that is the lack of understanding of consciousness within our culture. And that's where most of us has been brought up with, when you're dead, you're dead. And there's no notion of really what happens afterwards. There's not a clear understanding of what consciousness is. So while we have a remarkable culture in the modern world in terms of modern, you could say, material understanding and technologies, there's not, and this is by, the admission of science itself, consciousness is the hard problem. It's not understood. And while Buddhism, in the traditional Buddhist cultures, don't have advanced technologies, there is an understanding of what consciousness is. And this is then where the Buddha is coming from in terms of talking about the various realms of samsara and the the value of having right now human rebirth, how important it is to make use of that. Buddhist teachers nowadays, seeing how the modern audience is sort of overwhelmed by the descriptions of the various realms, choose very often to just focus on the cause of these realms with this psychological states. Because after all, the entire condition of samsara is premised on an understanding that our mind is what creates the phenomenology of samsara. It's what creates the phenomenology of nirvana. It's entirely a reality that's based on the mind. So that's where also the Buddhist view is that what creates our perception of a world is mind. And once we understand that, that's where we can see mind can go into two places. Now we can look in our own mind at our everyday life, and we can see also how our mind can go into, we can choose to be clear and constructive, or we can go into our habitual patterns of reacting the way that we do with aversion, attachment, and so forth. And that's where we describe our psychological experience, or we could say we describe the various kleshas, the various toxic conditions of our minds in terms of the six realms, or the five realms, where we have the condition of anger, aggression, as hell. And this is the cause of hell. Presently, we can see within our own world how we perpetuate the realm of hell through aggression. We perpetuate the condition of poverty through our particular practices of greed and stinginess and so forth. We perpetuate then, in that way, we perpetuate the hungry ghost realm. Similarly with the animal realm, similarly with the what we call demigods, the god realms, the human realms. All of these correspond to particular psychological conditions that we presently are familiar with. So we're never talking about the 6 realms as something that's unknown. But what we're talking about is once the mind is, after we leave this body, if the mind is stuck in some of these conditions like aggression or poverty and so forth, the problem is then we end up solidifying that into realms of experience. And that's where we talk about being stuck in some of these six realms. Now, again, the point why we are discussing the value of a human rebirth, impermanence, and also discussing the law of karma is for us to actually begin to take responsibility and appreciate the empowerment that's implicit in us actually making choices in terms of our actions. And that's where we acknowledge how what we do has an impact. And that's the bottom line about the law of karma. What we do has an impact. So here then, bringing this point home then, Jigme Lingpa says, the bird that soars in flight above the earth seems for the moment shadowless, but from its form the shadow does not part. When time and circumstances meet, it manifests. So we would say, of course, the bird is carrying its shadow, even though it's not seen. But when the bird lands on the ground, the shadow becomes very clearly manifest. So likewise, also when the conditions are there, our particular karma manifests. So Kangyur Rinpoche comments, the shadow of a bird soaring in the sky may be temporarily invisible, but it is still there and will always appear when the bird comes to earth. In the same way, when attendant causes coincide with the factors of craving and grasping, this is where we identify these conditions that are present within ourselves. Yeah, these are craving, sepa and lempa. Yeah, craving and grasping. Then karma comes to fruition and results in a life situation that is either favorable or unfavorable. As the sutra says, the karma that living beings gather is never worn away, even after 100 kalpas. When the moment comes and the appropriate conditions gather, the fruit of action will come to maturity. And that is then a concern, because we might think, well, ain't I on a trajectory? You sometimes have this this new age idea that, we're learning something each life, and then we're sort of getting a higher and higher rebirth. Well, try and look in our own life. What's the reality there? It's not like that. It's up and down, up and down. And so we might be very enlightened in one moment, followed by a moment of being completely unenlightened. So this sort of idea that there's some sort of divine plan in which things are just going to get better and better, and we'll become more and more beautiful and wiser and so forth. That's fantasy. That's it's not, in a way, it's sad that these kind of like naive ideas are percolating and pretending to be spirituality, because we can verify in terms of our own experience this is not how things work out. What we have inside, rather what we are, is entirely, what we experience is entirely dependent on what we carry with us in terms of our psychological material, and we don't know what that is. Whatever we construct and experience is on the basis of the ground of our consciousness, the alaya vijnana. And so that is what creates our experience. And we never know what that might be. That's why also we would say this is why it's imperative that we seek liberation, because we don't know what might be in our ground consciousness. Again, the good news is that we can do something about it. Right now, we can lay down seeds for future happiness, and we can create the conditions, the merit for proceeding along the path of liberation. Is someone not muted maybe? There's quite a lot of background noise. Oh yeah, there's an enormous amount of background noise. This is because I'm living under a temple and there's just been a gathering there. So I think they're just busy sweeping and cleaning up, and yeah, people are coming and going here. So I'm sorry about that, but there's not much I can do about it. I hope that's all right. Opportunity to meditate on patience. Okay. The karmic process is irresistible. So Jigme Lingpa writes, wrongful deeds, the mare that vomits fire, can desiccate the outer ocean's waves, the happy realms. The 100 deeds, the vast display, reveal how evil actions wreck the vessel of omniscience. So again, there's nothing that's a given here. Kangyur Rinpoche comments, for as long as phenomena are apprehended as truly existent, even small negative actions are liable to have immense consequences. Now let's just dwell on that a moment. This is the difference between relative truth and absolute truth. So as long as we are caught within relative truth, which is the place in which we apprehend phenomena as truly existent, and this is where we think I, this is where we think other, this is where we think there is a real, objects. We look at this and we think clock. We fail to see that this is just the changing wave of causes and conditions, the noises that you might be hearing, right? All of that, all of this, as long as we still objectify and have the fixation in which there is subject, object, and the creation of that as a solid phenomenon, that's where we are held within relative truth. And at that time, then we are subject to causes and conditions. The point of the path is to free ourselves. That's why we're talking about the path, not about just, well, in this case, we are talking about what really will drive happy rebirths. But ultimately here, the scope is also enlightenment. So right now, we are presently identifying if we want happiness, the conditions have to be there. Even small negative actions are liable to have immense consequences. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, they are likened in the root verse to a monstrous fire-vomiting mare, a reference to the volcanoes that encircle the ocean of brine on the rim of the world. So this is particular to the worldview that we were looking at before, in which then as the universe is perceived then in Indo-Tibetan cosmology, you then have this ocean where there's volcanoes that erupt, and they can dry up these oceans. The fire, Kangyur Rinpoche says, the fire of these volcanoes is able to dry up the countless waves of the sea that here symbolize happy incarnations, the fruit of positive actions. So it is important to study sutras such as the Sadharma, Smityu, Pastana, the Karma Shataka, the Lalita Vistara, and the Karma Vibhanga. Just a sec, I'll ask them to be quiet. Sonia, or Peter, do you think you could ask the people upstairs? It's fine that they're cleaning, but to not just be quiet, because we're doing some study here. Thank you. 4, they describe how our human condition, which is like a ship in which we can sail to the precious island of omniscience, may be wrecked and brought to utter ruin. So we have to understand that circumstances in which we have no power over, they very well could bring an end to our present fortunate conditions. So here we then say in verse 5 and 6, then we say, the overwhelming torments of the lower states have not yet pitched their camps of war within the hero's land, the stronghold of 10 virtues, and yet those who break their virtuous pledges fall beneath their sway. Some lose their discipline, and some their lives or length of days, some their austere practices, some their learning and possessions, some their moral conscience, some their sense of shame. So many have forsaken them for evil's sake. So as long as we haven't reached that place in which there's no return, you could say the hero's land, the stronghold of the 10 virtues, in which we, you could say, finally have something in which we are not going to fall back. Until we've reached that, then we can look in ourselves. And this is again the point I was making before. We might think we're on some, trajectory. It's getting better and better. And hopefully, yes, overall. But let's also face it, on that trajectory, there's a lot. It's a bit like what we call the jagged sort of teeth of the saw. There's a lot of, falling back. And so that's where we shouldn't think that it's sort of just bound to be in a particular way. There's plenty of examples around us of persons who have, lost lives at an early point, even great practitioners, all of a sudden they're gone. In the middle of somebody you would think was on the path to enlightenment, all of a sudden their life is over. Or somebody who's practicing well, all of a sudden something comes up and they completely abandon the path of enlightenment. That's also why Padampa Sanjay, he says, practice while you have faith, because even faith is impermanence. So Kangyur Rinpoche then says, comments, the results of evil deeds, namely the lower realms so full of dreadful and inescapable misery, are said in the root text to have been unable for the moment to overwhelm our strength, our army of 10 virtues tending to happiness. In other words, our fortunate existence in higher states. These virtues are like heroes whose land is not yet overrun by the legions of suffering. So in general, this mainly just refers to how that we are presently, we have the particular conditions of merit. The footnote here says, this means virtuous actions performed in conjunction with the belief in the real existence of the self, both of persons and phenomena. Such actions are productive of happiness in samsara, but do not lead beyond it. They are therefore to be contrasted with virtuous actions tending toward liberation, tarpya chatun, which produce liberation from samsara. So you have the kind of merit that will give you, you could say, a place that is constructive. But then there's the kind of merit that actually tends towards liberation, which is a greater kind of merit. So you have these two kinds of merit, those that tend towards happiness, which is what we would aspire to begin with, but then also ultimately the merit that tends towards liberation. So that's where and he says, so until we have arrived at that place, then our situation is essentially volatile. So then Kangyur says, and yet if our determination weakens, we shall fall into the 10 evil actions and thence into lower existences. There are many ways in which this might happen. Some people aspiring to liberation receive the vows of pure discipline from their abbots or preceptors, but tempted by desire or other evil thoughts, they break their commitments and fall, defeated in their monastic resolve. So that way we see people who take ordination, who are determined to pursue the path of liberation along the lines of the monastic discipline, they fall. And this we needn't look too far, for examples, to see examples like that. Again, some people kill animals for the sake of gain, thereby shortening their own lives. So again, we would say anyone who practices hunting or fishing in these kind of you could say livelihoods that shorten others' lives or take lives of others, they're very often prone to have shorter lives. So we would say one of the karmic results of killing is shortening of the killer's own life. Some, of course, this also, now we have to understand karma. here in the sense that karma doesn't mean one action leads to one thing. We here talk about, you could talk about the nature of killing is that it leads to shortening of lives, but it doesn't mean that you won't find a butcher who lives to a happy old age. You know, there might be a butcher who lives to be 120 or whatever, because that's due to other circumstances. So when we talk about karma, we always talk about the seed and the result. But between the seed and the result, you have circumstances. You have the apple seed, but then it depends on the soil, it depends on the precipitation, sun, heat, etc., quality of soil, and that will result in varying kinds of apple trees. So while the action of killing, it brings about shortening of life by nature, because you are involved in the constructing that which brings short life. There might be other circumstances that temporarily might influence also, but there's still the, you could say, the seed is there. The apple seed is there. It might manifest in various ways, and there might also be, for example, butchers who feel sorry for the animals. Already there's something that influences. There might be other circumstances that influence. So in terms of karma, we understand that actions have a result, but these results also are mediated and mitigated by circumstances. So then it says, some out of aggression go off to war only to be killed themselves. Some, inspired by virtue, embrace an ascetic discipline, becoming indifferent to food and clothing. But later, victims of their desire, they settle down to married life. So again, this is not to say that married life in and of itself is a bad thing, but what we're just saying, there would be those who aspire to a life entirely dedicated to the spiritual, and then all of a sudden they sort of, due to their circumstances, then their desire, attachments or whatever, where they had a particular sadhana, a particular path they were dedicated to, something gets in the way. So they had chosen a particular path but weren't able to follow through. It doesn't mean that you couldn't be a practitioner as a married person, but in the case of somebody that had a particular objective, then something got in the way. Some devote themselves with great effort to study and reflection, but they are unable to free themselves of the 8 worldly concerns and are carried away by mundane preoccupations. Some, instead of offering their wealth to the 3 jewels, lavish it on their relatives or squander it on lawsuits. So again, this is where we have a similar situation again, where there's some who are corrupted by these particular preoccupations. On the whole, a moral conscience with regards to oneself and one's religious values, and a sense of shame in respect of the opinions of others, are 2 factors that work in tandem to put a brake on evil behavior. Some people, however, abandon both their conscience and their sense of shame. They disregard virtuous conduct in one way or other, indulge in evil, succumbing to habit they have grown accustomed to from time without beginning. This is how people fall into the lower realms and stay there. So again, this is where you might have this quality of conscience, and that's where you're aware of your own actions and what they how they construct us, how we are constructed, and we are really the results of the, you could say, integrity, dignity that we feel from within. That's, you could say, moral conscience. Then there's the sense of shame that we have in terms of just being among others, that we're simply just sensitive to the world around us. So they work in terms of putting a brake on our, you could say, evil behavior, not in the sense that anybody's evil by, you could say, nature, but just there might be, you could say, the conditions that inevitably come around from self-centering, which is then the narrow-minded agenda of me. And that's where we perpetuate these, what we call the sort of various negative actions, the 10 negative actions and so forth. And that's where there's something that then inhibits the tendency towards being selfish, the tendency towards, you could say, being shameless and so forth. And that is these two things, conscience and shame. But then there are those who would just completely give up and simply just indulge in self-centering, in negative actions and so forth, without any kind of awareness about with regards to the consequence. And that's where conscience and opinion and shame normally would sort of inhibit that. Then once they're no longer there, then there's sort of a slippery slope in which then one goes to the lower realms. And when it says stay there, it means, of course, there's not ultimately staying there, but it's just that the conditions are there for perpetuating and experiencing this for a long time. So we'll stop here. See if there's any questions. I heard that experienced practitioners would eventually be able to cut karmic roots, i.e. lessen the effects of past karmic seeds, and that this could happen once someone starts planting new karma and continues practicing. Is that right? Yes, that's the point that's being made here. And this is what we're being encouraged to. We are being encouraged to become experienced practitioners. But until we actually get there, then we are conditioned by our actions. And that's where until we really have completely cut the effects of karmic seeds, then we're caught by karmic results. And that's where presently in this chapter here, we're looking at those individuals who aspire to simply just higher realms, to putting an end to suffering. And these individuals, they're not at a time where they can actually, they're not in a place where they can cut karma altogether. They're simply just creating the conditions for higher realms. And that's where, at this point then, we're really just talking about positive actions that create positive experiences. But of course, when it comes to absolute truth, and this is also Jigme Lingpa and the Kangyur Rinpoche's point further on, when it comes to absolute truth, yes, that's beyond karma. And hence also those who meditate on absolute truth and those who have realization of absolute truth, yes, they're no longer held by karma. What about we know the conditions and have awareness of them? Do we can manipulate them so have freedom on results, some kind of control? Yes, that's exactly the point here. And that's where we understand. And this is where we very often see this quote where he says to abandon negative actions and embrace positive actions and to master the mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So the very first thing that we are encouraged to on the path is really to create the conditions for happiness. And to do that, we need the awareness of cause and effect. So that's where we need to have this insight that we're being provided with presently, that our actions have an effect. But once we understand that actions have an effect, then we, of course, want to then create the conditions for future happiness. So thank you for thank you for the New Year wishes, everyone, by the way. It says here, the commentary by Kangyur Rinpoche, another book that can be found. Well, this is it. This is the commentary by Kangyur Rinpoche. There are in Tibetan other commentaries on Jigme Lingpa's root text, which are more extensive, and but unfortunately they're not translated presently. Yeah. Okay, so thank you. And someone says the sounds were no problem. Good. All right. Well, good. Anyway, my friends upstairs, they're, how do you say, they're being very, very careful now, I think. So anyway. Thank you for joining this session, and shall see you next year. And again, all the very best wishes for 2022. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the Holy Gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So, thank you.